before the lights came on. It started not with a red carpet, not with flashbulbs or designer gowns, but with silence. The kind of silence that lives in hotel rooms at 2 a.m. when the city outside is still awake, but you are not part of it. Sandra Bullock sat alone on the edge of the bed, her reflection dim in the large window that overlooked downtown Los Angeles. Her hands were clasped together, fingers tight, knuckles white. She wasn't nervous about the premiere. She wasn't worried about the cameras or the interviews or even the critics. It was something else, something older, something quiet. The kind of ache that doesn't show up in tabloids but lives inside you like a shadow. It had been nearly 2 decades since she and Keanu first shared a screen, back when everything still felt shiny and reckless and full of promise. The world had changed. So had they. Life had offered them both glitter and grief in equal measure. Careers that soared, losses that silenced, awards, applause, and long nights where nobody called. They had always found a strange kind of peace in each other's presence, a rare calm that didn't demand explanation. But even calm can be distant when life throws too much in between. The film they had just finished, a quiet love story about time and second chances, was the kind of project that didn't scream for attention. It whispered, it healed, it was personal, and it had taken more out of her than she expected, not just because of the role, but because it brought her back to a feeling she thought she had tucked away long ago. The sense that, with Keanu, things were always more real. A soft knock came at her sweet door. She stood, smoothing down the long cardigan she hadn't bothered to change out of. When she opened the door, he was standing there. Keanu. No entourage. No assistant. Just a black t-shirt, jeans, and a quiet smile that reached only one corner of his mouth. "I thought you might want to walk instead of ride," he said. She blinked. "Walk to the premiere? You know that's not exactly how these things work. I know. But tonight doesn't have to be like everything else." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She just grabbed her coat and followed him. Outside, the air was crisp for LA, the kind of night where even the palm trees felt still. They didn't talk much as they walked, just moved side by side like they had 1,000 times before on sets, on breaks, in the long spaces between camera calls. She looked over at him, and for a second she didn't see the legend or the icon. She saw the man who had stayed late after her father's funeral when everyone else had quietly slipped away. She saw the man who never asked her to be anything other than human. "You okay?" he asked without turning. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But this movie, it stirred something." "I know. Me too." They reached the side entrance of the theater, away from the blinding lights. The publicists were probably panicking by now. The red carpet had started. The press were asking questions. Cameras were searching. But Keanu, ever the silent rebel, simply opened the back door and let her in through the quiet hallways. Before they went out onto the stage for their entrance, he stopped her. "Sandy," he said, and there was something different in his voice, something deeper. She turned, and for a moment, it felt like time bent just a little, like the years between speed and now had collapsed into a single breath. "I know the world sees us a certain way," he continued, "but I need you to know, tonight isn't about the cameras or the crowd. It's about you, what you brought to this story, what you've always brought to mine." She felt the air catch in her throat. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't make me cry before we go out there." He gave her that rare, full smile, the one people chase but rarely see. "Then I'll wait till after." And with that, he offered his hand, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for her. She took it, and they walked onto the stage, not as co-stars, not as Hollywood figures, but as two people who had quietly carried each other through the weight of decades and were now, once again, standing in the light. The crowd erupted, but they didn't notice. They only saw each other. The moment the world stopped. The room had changed. The instant Keanu and Sandra stepped onto the low-lit stage from the side entrance, something in the atmosphere shifted. Not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable. Even through the polished theater walls and the rolling press coverage outside, there was a stillness that crept in as they walked together. There were no flashing lights here yet, no reporters shouting questions. It was just them. And a small backstage crew frozen in quiet awe at the rare, almost sacred energy between them. They weren't walking with the forced chemistry of promotional tours. They weren't playing characters anymore. They were two people, real, layered, and worn with years, walking into a space that was about to explode with applause and attention. But for now, it was silent. And in that silence, there was truth. Keanu didn't let go of her hand as they stepped onto the main stage. The curtain was moments from rising. The premiere had officially begun, but no one outside knew they were already here. Sandra turned toward him. Not to say something rehearsed or to perform for the crowd, but because she could feel it. The storm of emotions building behind his eyes. This wasn't just another red carpet for him either. It wasn't just another movie. It was something more. Something vulnerable. He leaned in slightly, just close enough that his voice barely reached her ears. "Do you trust me?" he asked. She nodded without hesitation. And then, the curtain rose. The lights hit them like waves. A sea of flashbulbs exploded. Reporters gasped. Fans rose from their seats. The world had expected a grand entrance from a limo. A slow walk up the red carpet, the usual media choreography. But what they got instead was a quiet, unscripted moment of intimacy and humanity. Sandra and Keanu, standing at center stage holding hands, eyes calm, clothes simple, expressions unshaken. It wasn't a performance, it was presence. And that presence echoed across every row, every camera, every whispering journalist trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Then, without a word, Keanu turned to Sandra in full view of everyone, and he did something no one expected. He stepped aside and gestured toward her with both hands, as if presenting her to the world. Not just as a co-star, not just as a leading lady, but as someone who had carried the soul of this film, and perhaps a part of his own soul as well. The audience went quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence, his gesture, his gaze said everything. It was respect. It was reverence. It was love, not the romantic kind that tabloids crave, but the rarer kind, the one built on time, trust, and shared silences. Sandra blinked, visibly moved. Her voice caught in her throat, but she managed to step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I thought I was coming to a movie premiere tonight, but I think I just walked into something more sacred." The audience erupted into a standing ovation. But Keanu, he didn't move. He stayed where he was, a few steps behind her, letting her have the light. It was a gesture so rare in an industry that thrived on ego, competition, and control. A moment where a man as globally admired as Keanu Reeves willingly stepped back to elevate someone else. And not for show, not for a headline, but because that was who he was. As the applause rolled over them, Sandra turned and mouthed two words that were caught on a few cameras but never spoken aloud. "Thank you." And then something else happened, something no one expected. Instead of retreating into the shadows after his moment of grace, Keanu walked to the edge of the stage, motioned for the house lights to dim, and asked, softly, humbly, for the orchestra to pause. He picked up a single chair and carried it to center stage, then looked toward the wings. Out walked an older woman in a modest, dark blue dress, with silver-gray hair pulled back and a humble grace in her steps. Most people didn't recognize her, but Sandra did instantly. It was the film's original screenwriter, a retired teacher from Vermont who had quietly sold her story rights years ago and faded back into the quiet countryside, where no one knew her name. Keanu helped her onto the stage, held her hand gently, and then leaned into the mic. "This story we're premiering tonight," he said, "was written by a woman who never imagined Hollywood would care. But we did, because she wrote it from her heart, and we felt it in ours. Tonight, she's the real voice behind what we're celebrating." The crowd fell silent, not out of confusion, but out of respect. Sandra placed her hand over her heart. Her eyes welled. The cameras shifted. And slowly the audience began to rise, one by one. A standing ovation not for fame, but for grace. That was the moment that would become the photo heard around the world. Keanu Reeves in a black tailored suit, bowing next to an elderly writer who clutched her chest in disbelief, and Sandra Bullock standing beside them, her hand resting on the woman's shoulder, whispering something that would remain a secret forever. The press didn't know what to say. There was no scandal, no twist, no headline-grabbing mistake, just humility, humanity, and two Hollywood giants using their spotlight to lift someone else. Later, when the film played and the lights dimmed, Sandra and Keanu didn't sit in the front row with the executives. They sat in the middle, with the writer between them, holding her hands, laughing with her, crying with her, honoring her story like it was their own. It was. Because the truth was, the film they had just made, the one about time and second chances, wasn't just a script, it was their reflection. And tonight, the whole world saw it. After the applause. The echo of the standing ovation still lingered in the grand hall long after the film had ended. As the credits rolled in gold against a quiet piano score, no one dared move. The theater, packed with actors, critics, and executives, remained frozen in a collective hush, as if they were all silently agreeing that something rare had just occurred, and to move too quickly would be to break its spell. When the lights came back up, some clapped again, softly this time, as if applauding a sacred moment rather than a movie. A few wiped away tears they didn't want to explain. Even the most hardened journalists found themselves wordless, their pens resting on notepads now irrelevant. They hadn't just witnessed a premiere, they had been allowed into something personal, something not meant to be consumed but felt. Backstage, away from the applause and the flashbulbs waiting again at the after-party, Sandra Bullock sat quietly on an old leather couch. Her heels were off. Her shoulders, bare now that she had shrugged off the designer shawl, were trembling slightly, not from cold, but from release. Her face wasn't painted with tears yet, but her eyes held them like a storm held just beneath the surface, the kind of tears that had been gathering for years. She was alone. Or she thought she was. Then she felt it, not a sound, not a breath, just a presence. Keanu didn't say a word as he entered the room. He didn't announce himself or knock or ask if she wanted company. He just came in like someone who had every right to be there, not because of entitlement, but because of understanding. And Sandra? She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She just let the silence between them fill the room like a familiar blanket, comforting and unspoken. Then, finally, she broke. Her hands covered her face, and the tears came not in a rush, but in a slow, aching flow. Tears not just from tonight, but from years of holding things together, from roles played off-screen, from griefs carried in private, from strength performed for too long. Keanu knelt in front of her, not beside, not above, but directly in front, grounding her in the moment, not asking for her to stop crying, not offering platitudes or shallow comfort. He simply placed, his hands gently over hers, slowly removing them from her face, revealing eyes that no longer needed to hide. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice soft, low, and impossibly steady. "I saw you tonight," he said. "Not the actress, not the public figure, just you, and you were more beautiful than ever." She blinked, searching his face for some sign of performance, some trace of Hollywood gloss, but there was none, only sincerity, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "I don't think I can do this much longer," she whispered, her voice shaking. The pretending, the smiling, the holding it all together. "You don't have to," he replied. "Not with me." That's when she broke completely. She leaned forward, forehead resting against his, and he stayed there, unmoving, eyes closed, sharing the weight she had carried. They didn't kiss. They didn't hug. It wasn't about romance. It was deeper than that. It was two people who had watched each other survive in silence, now choosing to be unmasked. Together. After a long while, she pulled back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes laughter is all that's left after the heart has emptied itself of everything else. Keanu smiled too, that rare, full smile that only she ever seemed to bring out. "You always show up when I'm unraveling," she said. "I don't think you're unraveling," he replied. "I think you're becoming real again." She looked at him for a long time, eyes still red but now calm, like the ocean after a storm. "Do you think people saw through it?" she asked. Keanu leaned back slightly and shrugged with that quiet grace he had perfected over the years. "I think they saw something true, and I think they loved you more for it." She nodded, grateful. Not just for the words, but for the timing of them, for the way he always knew when to say less, not more. Just then, one of the young assistants came to the door, hesitating as if afraid to interrupt something sacred. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, "the after-party is waiting. They're asking for both of you." Keanu glanced at Sandra. She exhaled deeply, reached for her shoes, but didn't put them on. She stood barefoot, grounding herself in the moment. "I'll go," she said, but not as the actress, not as the public figure. Keanu rose beside her. "Then, go as Sandra. That's more than enough." And so they walked, not into another crowd or another spotlight, but into a space where the truth had already been seen. They had nothing to prove. Not tonight. And as they stepped into the hallway, she did something no one expected. She reached for his hand, not because the cameras were watching, but because she knew, even in her most fragile state, that there was no place safer than next to him. The room full of noise and one quiet look. The after-party buzzed with the electric chaos that always followed a successful premiere. Lights glimmered off the marble floors of the rooftop venue. The skyline of Los Angeles spread out like a glittering sea beyond the tall glass walls. Music played, soft enough to talk over, but loud enough to keep people from truly listening to each other. Waiters in black carried silver trays with hors d'oeuvres no one could pronounce. Laughter danced from corner to corner, floating through clouds of champagne and shallow conversation. Cameras hovered like insects, politely keeping their distance but ready to pounce on any unscripted moment that might become tomorrow's headline. It was a beautiful room, and an exhausting one. Sandra stood near the entrance, heels in her hand, once again, her bare feet cushioned by the expensive carpet as she tried to gather her breath. Around her, people smiled, congratulated her, complimented her performance, praised her wardrobe, and yet none of it pierced the surface. It was like being underwater, watching life happen through a glass wall, unable to fully step into it. She nodded, she thanked, she accepted the compliments with grace, but her mind was elsewhere. Or rather, with someone else. Keanu had disappeared the moment they arrived. Not out of rudeness, but because he knew her. Really knew her. He knew that too much attention, too much noise, too much artificial celebration would overwhelm her after the emotional unraveling backstage. So he gave her space. Not distance. Space. And there was a difference. But still, she searched for him. Not with panic. Not with neediness. But with quiet trust. And then, she saw him. He stood across the room, not at the center of attention. Not with the high-powered producers or A-list celebrities, but near the bar, speaking to the same elderly screenwriter he had honored earlier that night. He leaned slightly as she spoke, his posture open, his gaze attentive. The kind of attention that was rare in rooms like this. The kind that said, "You matter." And in that moment, something shifted in Sandra. Not just her mood or her energy, but something deeper. Something in the architecture of her heart. It was like watching someone do the thing they've always done, and suddenly realizing it's the reason you feel safe in the world. She didn't move toward him immediately. Instead, she stood still, observing not the movie star, not the man, with the global following, but the one person who had ever seen all of her, and stayed. Then, as if he felt her gaze before he saw it, Keanu turned. Their eyes met across the room, and everything else disappeared. The noise faded. The music quieted. The lights dimmed. Not literally, but spiritually. The way the world does when two souls meet in a room full of masks. He gave her a small nod. Not a beckon, not an invitation. Just a simple, "I see you." And so she crossed the room. Not like a celebrity, not like a woman playing a part, but like a friend moving toward another, like a heart stepping out of hiding. When she reached him, he offered her a glass of water, not champagne. She smiled at the small but deeply intentional gesture. "You disappeared," she said softly. "I knew you'd find me," he replied. She sipped the water, then turned to the writer who still stood beside them, her face glowing with disbelief at all the attention. "You should have seen her," Keanu said to Sandra, nodding at the older woman. "She was just telling me how she wrote the first draft of this film while recovering from surgery. Said the story came to her in a dream." Sandra turned toward the woman with new warmth. "That dream changed everything tonight." The woman blinked, overcome, tears forming behind thick glasses. "I never thought I'd live to see it come to life. And then, to have the two of you treat it like something sacred." She trailed off, emotion stealing her voice. Keanu placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "It was sacred. You just reminded us." As the woman stepped away, someone else approached, a publicist, wide-eyed and frantic, clearly trying to wrangle the stars for a photo op with the studio heads. But before she could say anything, Keanu raised a polite hand. "Later," he said, calmly but firmly, and just like that, the moment was protected. Sandra turned to him, a soft smile forming. "You always know how to make space where I can breathe." "I just try not to steal your air," he replied, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled something out. Not a ring, not a gift, but a folded piece of paper, worn around the edges. He handed it to her without explanation. She opened it slowly. It was a note. Handwritten, years old. She recognized it instantly. It was something she had written him long ago, back when they were filming one of their first projects together. A small note, scribbled in the quiet between scenes. She had forgotten it, but he hadn't. "In a world full of noise, thank you for being my silence. Sandy." She looked up at him, stunned. "You kept this?" "I carry it," he said. "Some days it's the only thing that keeps me grounded." She didn't know what to say, so she folded the paper carefully and placed it against her heart. And then, in a room filled with photographers, producers, and stars, he asked her the most unexpected thing of all. "Would you dance with me?" She blinked. "Here. Here now, no cameras, no stage. Just us." And so, in a quiet corner of a loud room, with no music cued and no spotlight waiting, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves swayed gently together in silence. No choreography, no audience. Just presence, just peace. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, her eyes closed, and she realized she wasn't tired anymore. The bench beneath the stars. Long after the rooftop lights dimmed, long after the last of the guests had spilled into waiting black cars and limousines, and long after the music faded into memory, the night clung to its silence like a final curtain refusing to fall. Somewhere in the city, the echoes of celebration continued. But up here, away from it all, time slowed, softened, and finally stood still. Keanu and Sandra didn't leave with the others. They slipped away quietly, not to avoid the cameras, but because the moment called for something gentler than flashbulbs and press. He led her to a quiet terrace just beyond the garden, a small stone path weaving through the lavender and sage. It was late, past midnight. The air had cooled, and the city lights shimmered below like scattered gold. And there, nestled between two hedges that blocked the world, was a single wooden bench facing the skyline, a forgotten part of the venue. Private and untouched, Keanu sat first, brushing a few fallen petals away with his hand. Sandra joined him, pulling her knees up slightly on the bench, hugging them close, still barefoot from the long night. Her hair, once styled with perfection, had come undone slightly, softening her face in a way that made her look almost like a girl again, the girl she had been when they first met. Before the fame, before the losses, before the walls, they each built around themselves out of necessity, not choice. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The wind carried only the sound of distant traffic and the soft hum of garden lights. And in that silence, Sandra felt her chest rise and fall in a rhythm that was no longer tight with anxiety. It was peace. "I didn't think I'd feel this calm tonight," she finally said, her voice like wind through leaves. "You weren't meant to feel calm," Keanu said. "You were meant to feel seen. And you were." She turned to him, searching his face not for validation, but for understanding. He always had this way of seeing through noise, through performance, through the layers people wore to survive. And now, she realized, he had never tried to fix her, only to sit beside her while she found her own way. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked. "Of holding it together? Of being the one everyone says is so grounded, so generous, so quiet?" He exhaled, leaning back slightly against the bench. "All the time," he said. "But then I remember that silence isn't weakness. It's where I find myself again." Sandra looked out over the city. "Sometimes I feel like I've been playing a version of myself for so long." "I forgot what the real me sounds like." Keanu turned toward her. "That's why I kept your note. Because that was you. That one sentence. It wasn't a performance. It was your truth." She felt her throat tighten again. That simple folded piece of paper, written in exhaustion in a trailer between takes, had outlived studios, scripts, and even people. And yet, somehow, he had carried it with him all these years, like a compass. "You make me feel safe," she whispered. "Even when everything else feels like it's slipping away." He didn't respond right away. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small velvet pouch, and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, eyebrows lifting. "Just open it." Inside was a small silver charm. Simple, understated, elegant. It was the shape of a bench. She smiled, puzzled. "A bench." "I had it made," he said, "to remind me that the most important moments don't happen under spotlights. They happen here, quiet places, real conversations, unscripted connection. This bench, right now, means more to me than any stage we've ever stood on." She looked down at the charm in her palm, then up at him. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you've always been my quiet place, even when I didn't deserve it, even when I forgot how to show it." Something cracked open in her then. Not in pain, but in clarity. All the years, all the moments they had shared in half-glances and half-spoken truths, all the interviews where they deflected questions with laughter, all the quiet mornings on set sipping coffee without words. It had all been leading to this. Not a confession, not a grand gesture, but a reckoning. A gentle, irrevocable truth. She leaned in, resting her head against his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He simply turned slightly so her weight could fit against him naturally, like a memory they had both forgotten but never lost. The wind picked up, brushing through the leaves, carrying the scent of garden roses. A moment passed, then another, and then he said it. Not as a declaration, but as a simple truth, born of stillness and time. "I've loved you in quiet ways, Sandra. Ways that didn't need to be said. But maybe it's time." She didn't lift her head. She didn't pull away. Her voice was so soft it barely made it into the air. "Then say it now." "While the night is listening," he kissed the top of her head gently. "I love you. Not in the movies. Not in scripts. But here, in the silences. In the places no one sees." Her breath caught, and in that moment, for the first time in years, she let herself believe in something again. Not a love story written by others, but the one they had been writing, quietly beneath the noise all along. when the city slept and the heart spoke. The first breath of dawn came not with trumpets but with whispers, the faint hush of light brushing over the city skyline, as if the sun itself was hesitant to interrupt the two souls still seated on that wooden bench, wrapped not in blankets but in each other's presence. Los Angeles, so often loud and relentless, had paused. The world slept. The headlines waited, and in that sacred stillness, Sandra and Keanu remained, motionless, wordless, entirely real. They had not moved in over an hour. Sandra's head still rested against his shoulder, and Keanu's arm remained gently draped across her back, not to claim her, but to hold her steady in a moment she hadn't realized she needed this deeply. The velvet pouch with the bench charm still lay between them on the wood, catching the early light like a quiet promise. Eventually, Sandra sat up, slowly, not to break the moment, but to breathe fully for the first time in years. Her hair fell in loose waves around her face. Her makeup had long faded. Her voice, when it returned, was bare of performance. "Do you think this was always supposed to happen?" she asked. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the horizon, where golden hues kissed the edge of night and day. "I don't think it matters what was supposed to," he finally said. "Only what we choose now." She nodded, her hands folding into her lap. "You know what's strange?" she said after a pause. "We've lived entire lifetimes between the spaces people thought they understood. Years of friendship, grief, phone calls at 3 a.m., shared silence in dressing rooms, and no one ever really saw that. They weren't meant to," he said. "Some stories aren't public. They're sacred." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the man beneath the legend, the gentle warrior, the quiet observer, the soul who had been quietly showing up for her in ways she hadn't always recognized. And now she saw it all. "You never pushed," she said. "Even when I pulled away." "I never had to," he replied. "I knew you'd find your way back." She looked down at her bare feet against the stone terrace floor, at the quiet charm between them, at the sky that was growing lighter with every passing minute. "I've spent so much time afraid to need anyone," she confessed, afraid that needing meant weakness. "But with you, I think needing you just means I'm finally human." Keanu turned toward her, his eyes steady. "And loving you means I'm finally alive." No grand kiss followed. No choreographed romance. Just a quiet moment that thundered louder than any red carpet revelation. They didn't need fireworks. The sun rising over the city was enough. She leaned into him again, and this time he turned his face toward hers. Their foreheads touched gently, like two stars aligning in secret. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. He smiled. "Then let's find out, together." They stood, not in haste, but in quiet readiness. The night was gone. The day was beginning, and something in both of them had shifted. Not a restart, not a beginning, but an arrival. Before leaving, Keanu took one final glance at the bench. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black fountain pen. On the underside of the bench, in a small hidden space where only they would ever know to look, he wrote, "This is where truth sat." And it never needed an audience. Sandra watched him write, her heart aching in the best possible way. "Will anyone ever know what happened here?" she asked softly. He looked up at her. "We will. And that's enough." They walked down the stone path, her shoes still in hand, his coat now draped around her shoulders. The garden behind them faded into morning, and as they exited through the back gates of the venue, unnoticed, unrecorded, the city came alive again. Cars moved. Screens lit up. The noise returned. But for Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, something had changed forever. Not in the eyes of the world, but in the quiet sanctuary they had always found in each other, and this time, they chose not to walk away from it. Not again. Not ever. The end.